see the engine and wings crashing into the building? These simulations of the impact really are shocking, and they aim to explain the reasons behind the most widely discussed collapse in history. What really caused the collapse of the Twin Towers? How is it possible that they only took about 10 seconds to collapse? And what do we know about the much debated steel temperature issue? And what's more, several hours later, why did Tower 7 also collapse even though it wasn't hit by a plane? Those of you who have been following Geopop for a while will know that we've made a number of videos on the World Trade Center disaster of September 11, 2001. In order to give you the most reliable and consistent scientific explanations possible, to provide further clarity, we've decided to put all the content created by our editorial team over the years together in a single video to try to answer the questions and address the aspects that have most fueled conspiracy theories about the attacks that literally changed history. I want to point out that nobody actually knows the absolute truth about what happened that day. Here we present you with the version that is most widely accepted by scientific experts, the one put forward by the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, one of the most prestigious scientific institutes in the United States. It analyzed thousands of witness statements, pieces of video evidence, photographs, and fragments of debris collected from the Ground Zero site, simulating scenarios in the laboratory similar to what happened that day to the towers. So, understanding how the two buildings were designed and built is essential to comprehending the dynamics of the collapse, which, according to the NIST, was not directly caused by the impact of the planes, but was triggered by the subsequent failure of the steel due to the very high temperatures reached in the impact zone floors. But let's work our way through it methodically. Hi folks, I'm Andrea, I'm the founder of Geopop. I'd like to inform you that this video has been recorded in Italian and dubbed with AI. So the content is not AI generated. Nothing is AI but the dubbing and lip sync. So I really hope you will appreciate our work. If yes, please subscribe to our channel where you can find several scientific contents. Standing at 417 and 414 meters, respectively, each of the two buildings had 110 floors and was composed of 250,000 tons of steel. At the time, they were the tallest skyscrapers in the world, as well as the beating heart of the World Trade Center, designed by architect Minoru Yamasaki in 1962 to become a revolutionary economic hub, which was why it was called the World Trade Center, and which also included Tower 7, or WTC7, the third building that collapsed on the day of the attack, which housed the electrical substation that supplied power to the entire World Trade Center complex. Using steel to construct skyscrapers is one of the best ways to create ultralight structures that can be developed vertically. The basic idea was to make each floor a huge open space, uninterrupted by columns and support walls. For this to be achieved, the mass of the building had to be minimized, and it had to be able to support the vertical load, that is, the load of the people plus that of the structure itself, and the horizontal load, that is, the force of the wind. Why steel? Because steel has elastic properties that allow it to react to loads with flexibility, but when subjected to high temperatures, it can weaken to the point of completely losing its ability to withstand certain loads, just as it did in the tower's case.
Holy shit! What happened? Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God!
Let's take a closer look at the structure of the towers. The structure was organized into four so-called major subsystems. for blocks that provided the building with structural redundancy or robustness, which made the towers very stable because, in the event of damage to one of the systems, the load would be redistributed to the other systems that were still intact. It's essential that this be explained if we want to understand the cascade of events that caused the steel to weaken. The four subsystems were the exterior wall perimeter columns, the central core, the floor system, and the hat truss, essentially the roof. The perimeter columns were arranged along the perimeter of the building and provided resistance to lateral loads. There were 59 on each side, for a total of 236 around the entire perimeter. The central core was about 1,000 square meters in size and was located at the heart of the building. It extended for practically the entire height of the tower, and inside there were another 47 support columns and service elements such as stairs and elevators. The third subsystem, the flooring system, was composed of lightweight concrete slabs fixed on steel platforms. The floor had the triple function of supporting the perimeter columns and carrying part of the horizontal and vertical loads. Finally, the fourth subsystem, the hat truss, the roof structure, had the primary function of supporting the antennas, but it was also important in load distribution, as it provided an additional connection between the perimeter and the core structure. The North Tower and the South Tower of the World Trade Center were designed to withstand an additional one-third load. In addition to the gravitational load and the horizontal load, that of the impact of a 707 airplane, which in the 60s and 70s was the largest in the world. Even though the American Airlines 767, the one that crashed, was much larger than a 707, the NIST specifies that it was not the impact itself that weakened the structure, which, on the contrary, only swayed by 30 centimeters. However, in a certain sense, it was the spark that triggered a series of contributing factors that eventually weakened the steel of the two buildings to the extent that they collapsed. At this point, let's take a look at the behavior of steel. One of the major technical doubts about the collapse of the Twin Towers focuses precisely on the fact that it's not possible that the towers fell because the steel melted, since this material melts at around 1,500 degrees Celsius, and in the towers that temperature was never reached. It's true. The temperature never got as high as that, but there's a more pertinent technical question we should be asking. What happens to steel when it's under stress and reaches temperatures that, while not as high as 1,500 degrees Celsius, are still extremely high? According to the NIST simulations, the collapse was actually triggered by a loss of steel strength. It didn't melt, but it lost strength. To be precise, there was a loss of strength in some areas of the floors in the impact zone, where fires would have caused temperatures to increase to peaks of 900 to 1,000 degrees Celsius. At this point, it's important we understand how steel behaves from a physical standpoint when we apply loads and when the temperature rises. I therefore suggest we examine its behavior in two situations using two different graphs. Firstly at room temperature, and then as the temperature increases up to 1,000 degrees Celsius. On the y-axis, we have the stress. So for example, the load that might be applied to a piece of steel. The strain, or how much the steel component deforms in response to the stress, is plotted on the x-axis. What we have here is a typical stress-strain diagram, as used in engineering by experts in the field. This is how steel behaves at room temperature. Up until the yield point, also known as yield strength, as shown on the graph, the steel will behave in an elastic way. What does that mean? Simply put, it means that if I remove the applied load, the steel will return to its original state, without undergoing permanent deformation. If, on the other hand, I continue to increase the load proportionally, once the yield stress is passed, the steel will deform in a way that is no longer proportional. We enter the so-called plastic phase. It's no longer elastic, but plastic, in which the more I increase the load, the more the steel deforms. And it's important to note that after this point, the deformation becomes irreversible. In other words, if I remove the load, the steel remains deformed. It's deformed, but despite the deformation, it's still capable of bearing the applied load. However, if the load continues to increase, the steel reaches its breaking point, meaning the steel is no longer able to exert enough force to resist the additional load. In other words, the steel collapses. As I said before, this is an example of how steel behaves at room temperature. But what happens if the temperature increases? Let's take more or less the same graph we looked at before, but this time we'll add in the temperature variable. As you can see, the elbow of the curve gets sharper and sharper. In other words, it means that with the same applied load, when the steel heats up, compared to when it's, let's say, cold, it reaches the plastic phase much sooner. In technical terms, it is said to lose stiffness, and similarly, its strength is reduced. In essence, in a nutshell, the higher the temperature, the more the steel deforms and the sooner it reaches its breaking point. According to European design standards, at 200 degrees Celsius steel loses 10% of its stiffness, but it's still within the elastic phase. Already at 500 degrees Celsius, if the load increases, the loss of stiffness and strength becomes significant, and the building's ability to bear loads decreases at 1000 degrees Celsius, as specified by the NIST in its report. Steel loses 95% of its load-bearing capacity. At this point, the question is, how does the NIST explain the collapse as a consequence of the loss of steel strength? When the planes crashed into the towers at a speed of about 700 kilometers per hour, they literally disintegrated in less than a second due to the enormous difference between their weight and that of the structures. Each plane weighed 130,000 kilograms, while the weight of each building was around 450,000 tons, almost 10 times that of the Titanic. We have to keep in mind that the planes were carrying approximately 30,000. That's right, I said 30,000 liters of fuel each, which after the impact literally atomized into highly flammable droplets. The first plane, which struck the North Tower at 8:46 a.m. between the 93rd and 99th floors, severed 37 of the building's perimeter columns and 9 of its core columns. The second plane, which was more tilted on impact than the first, hit the South Tower at 2 minutes past 9 between the 77th and 85th floors, severing 33 perimeter columns and 10 core columns. On the floors involved in the impact, in both towers, the fireproofing material protecting the steel was almost entirely compromised. We're talking of 43 of the total 47 core columns in the North Tower and 39 of the 47 in the South Tower, in addition to thousands of square meters of flooring being completely stripped of insulating material. In the areas where the steel was stripped of its insulation, at around 900 to 1000 degrees Celsius, its load-bearing capacity failed. Thanks to the structural redundancy we mentioned earlier, the load was redistributed to the still intact perimeter columns and the flooring system, which initiated the collapse on the floors affected by the fires. The colder block literally began to pull the perimeter columns inwards. This inward movement rendered the wall practically incapable of bearing the load. At this point, already partially weakened due to the fires, the other perimeter columns and the remaining core columns could no longer support the weight of the building. Why weren't the collapses of Tower 1 and Tower 2 arrested by the intact structures below the impact zone floors? Through a series of complex mathematical calculations, The NIST determined that the columns supporting the intact floor below the levels of the collapse were adequate to carry the load of 11 additional floors if the load was applied gradually, and 6 additional floors if the load was applied suddenly, as it was in this case. Since there were 12 and 29 floors above the collapse levels in the North Tower and the South Tower respectively, neither tower could have stopped the progression of the collapse, especially considering that, as the weight of the floors below was added to it, the mass increased as it fell. The energy released was of such magnitude that the floors below offered practically no resistance. That's why, from the moment the collapse started, it took only 9 seconds in the case of the South Tower and 11 seconds in that of the North Tower for the upper sections of the building to crash to the ground. At this point, let's move on to Tower 7 or WTC7. Why did it collapse if it was not hit by a plane? Perhaps what fueled the largest number of conspiracy theories was the destruction of Tower 7, which collapsed about 7 hours after the North Tower at around 5:20 p.m. Despite no plane ever hitting it, it crumbled in just a few seconds, much like the towers did. Many have insinuated that deliberate explosions caused the structural failure, but also for Tower 7, the NIST came to its conclusions after carrying out an in-depth investigation. Before I give you the NIST version, it's important that you understand the context and what kind of building Tower 7 was. We're talking about a 47-story building located approximately 105 meters from the North Tower, which at 10:28 was the second building to collapse after the South Tower on September 11, 2001. Tower 7 was shaped like an irregular trapezoid and had a total surface area of 200,000 square meters. In 1970, the construction of the first 6 floors was completed. Only 20 years later were the other 41 floors added to accommodate new offices. The structure, with a total of 47 floors, was completed in 1990. On September 11, 2001, when the North Tower came down, burning debris shot out, hitting various buildings in a range of hundreds of meters, including Tower 7. In addition to damaging the southwestern part of the building, they caused fires on at least 10 floors, between the 7th and 30th floors. According to the NIST reconstructions, it was between the 7th and 9th floors and between the 11th and the 13th floors that there were favorable conditions that enabled the fire to spread uncontrollably. Why were there favorable conditions? Most of the additional floors of Tower 7 were designed, as we mentioned, to house workstations and were therefore filled with combustible office materials, desks, printers, computers, and so on. The structure was supported by 58 perimeter columns and 24 internal columns, 21 of which made up the central core. The other 3 internal columns, numbers 79, 80, and 81, had the primary function of supporting the floors that connected the core and the east side of the building, which were longer than the other floors due to the irregular shape of the building. Now, this is a crucial point because the collapse was triggered precisely by the failure of one of these 3 columns, number 79. So let's look at the dynamics of the collapse of Tower 7. The floors were made of metal beams coated with reinforced concrete. The beams and concrete distributed the weight to each other and in turn distributed it to the columns. Both the floors and the columns were coated with fireproof material, a protection against fire, calculated to increase the resistance time by 2 hours for the floors and 3 hours for the columns. Due to the high temperatures, which reached around 600 degrees Celsius, the beams and floor connections, which were covered with thinner fireproof material compared to the columns, heated up first, and the so-called phenomenon of thermal expansion occurred. When steel is heated, in fact, its volume increases, and if this expansion is constrained by columns or other steel elements, forces develop that can create instability. According to the NIST, this is exactly what happened to the long spandrel beam that connected column 44 to column 79. Distended by thermal expansion, as well as inevitably weakened by the high temperatures, the connection with column 79 was broken, initiating this so-called progressive collapse. In other words, the propagation of localized damage from one structural element to another, leading to the collapse of an entire structure. The floor of the 13th floor lost its support and collapsed. Column 79 basically bent downwards, setting off a collapse that cascaded through the floors below until the global collapse brought it down all at once. Now, why did the NIST rule out explosions? The NIST provided two explanations after reconstructing the exact same scenario in the laboratory. An explosion would have destroyed most of the windows that had instead remained intact until the time of the collapse. An explosion would not have caused the building's walls to crumple inward. It would instead have made them shoot outward. Another question you will find around the web is, why didn't rescue teams intervene, and why weren't the fire suppression systems activated? The collapses of the towers had caused dozens and dozens of casualties, including among rescue workers, who suddenly found themselves dealing with a never-before-seen situation. What's more, Tower 7 was surrounded by smoke from the debris, and most importantly, all water sources were damaged. Extinguishing the fire under those conditions proved practically impossible. Fortunately, the 4,000 people who were working in Tower 7 that morning had been evacuated after the impact of the two planes into the twin towers. In conclusion, this reconstruction, which is embraced by the vast majority of the scientific community, presents us with a perspective that's somewhat different from what's been said over the years. Namely that these structures actually withstood the impacts and remained standing for a long time considering the damage they sustained. For example, if the towers had not been so structurally solid, the loss of human lives might have been 10 times greater. So, if you happen to talk to a civil engineer, they will probably tell you that the towers, the twin towers, performed excellently from an engineering standpoint, because they withstood movie-like damage for around an hour. Of course, with this video, we're not trying to convince anyone that it happened exactly this way. It's something that's very complex and doubts will remain for many, of course, but I think it's interesting to look at certain technical scientific aspects, ones that are perhaps less talked about, but actually go a long way to explaining, if not everything. A lot. That said, dear friends, I hope all our months of hard work pay off and that you like this video. I'll see you next time, always here on Geopop, Everyday Science.